One person writes, if you are alone in a house, do you get that hair stand up on the back of your neck feeling like you're being watched? For you, what triggers it? For her, it is connected with sound.
No, I've never had that feeling until this question now, that is. And I'm at home alone. Great, thanks. Bumps and thumps do that to me. I suppose they're usually from neighboring flats or houses on the row. Once when I was staying alone, house sitting for friends, I kept feeling this repeated thump. I started to get scared, as it was a detached house, no neighboring houses on either wall, and texted my friend. It turned out that a thunderstorm had suddenly broken. The curtains were closed and I hadn't seen it. Now, I grew up in Florida and I know thunderstorms. Guess the unfamiliar surroundings just threw me off.
We have talked about some of your other senses through this interview. Do you feel any of your other senses are heightened because you are deaf?
Research has shown that many deaf people have better peripheral vision than hearing people. I know I often feel vibrations that hearing people say they can't feel. I think they are just distracted by what they hear. Sound is vibration, after all. It just makes sense that with less distractions, you notice more things. I know that I feel vibrations better if I'm not wearing hearing aids.
Someone asked, if you could be hearing for one day, would you want to? And what would you want to hear?
If it were for just one day, I suppose I'd give it a go. I could put up with almost anything for a day. To be boring and scientific, if that were to actually happen somehow, my brain wouldn't know what to do with all that new foreign input, and it probably wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. If part of this hypothetical miracle would be that my brain could process and pleasantly interpret said input as someone who had been hearing their whole life, then being on the ocean and the birds and Beethoven's and Bohemian Rhapsody and all the cliches, I'd rather have wings for a day. That would be uber cool. Or even one of those lithe runner bodies. I've always sucked at running. It would be amazing to complete a marathon. Or be a cat. I'd love to spend a day inside my cat's head. Yeah, I don't think I'd waste a one-day scenario on hearing.
How do you see being deaf as a superpower? When has it gotten you out of awkward situations?
We are totally awesome communicators. Forget about lip reading. We can travel anywhere and feel at home. Connect with anyone who is open to it on our terms. Because even in our hometowns, we have to teach people how to communicate with us every day, every single day. Every single day we talk with people who don't know our language. So we don't bat an eye when confronted with someone whom we may share no common language with at all. My research in recent years has actually been on that very superpower. We've studied how deaf signers from different countries communicate when they first meet each other, sharing no common language, signed or otherwise, not even English, and how that communication evolves over time with daily contact. I'm not talking about international sign. We are careful to select participants who have had no knowledge of IS and no significant experience traveling. So when you bring together an Indonesian, a Jordanian, a Japanese, a Brit, all deaf and fluent in their respective national languages, magic happens. It's probably much how international sign started many years ago. In a way, we turn back the clock to see how it may have been created. They learn some of each other's sign languages, but sophisticated gestures are used from the start, and novel signs are created within the group. The local sign language takes a leading role, as participants also interact with deaf people in the host community. I mean, from the very first minute they meet, which we documented, of course, they talk, and not just about the weather. Can you imagine how it would go if 4 hearing people had no common language, were sat in front of a camera and told to talk to each other? You could hear the crickets. So I don't know about awkward situations, except maybe occasional speeding ticket that I got off with just a warning. But I'm sure my deaf powers have opened many doors. I was the first person in my family, all hearing, to have a passport. I don't understand why some hearing people are so amazed that deaf people travel alone. I've seen so many hearing people who freeze when confronted with someone who doesn't speak English, or whatever their native tongue is. They don't even know how to ask where the toilet is. Some apparently don't even know how to count on their fingers. Also, I think it's difficult for many hearing people to make friends whilst traveling. Deafies, wherever we go, find others and have an instant contact or a new friend. Yes, I said deafies. We sometimes call ourselves that. You can't use that word, though. It's like hooting, in group only. Sorry.
Thank you so much for being willing to share all of your wisdom with us today. Before we sign off, I just have 2 final questions. A number of hearing listeners asked, what can we as hearing folks do to make the world better for deaf folks? Or some version of that question. They all had different ways of stating it. Maybe that would be the same answer, but as a final question, what are 3 things you wish we knew?
How to make the world better? Here are a few ideas. Learn a sign language. It's always great to find that someone signs, even a little. Just yesterday, the staff person at the public library desk knew some BSL and was able to help me that way. I always ask someone first if they sign before breaking out the pen and paper. Most of the time the answer is no, but sometimes I get a nice surprise. Watch deaf presenters and artists on YouTube, storytellers, poets, song signers. Like, subscribe, promote them, not hearing people signing songs. Promote #DeafTalent. While learning that sign language, do not post videos of yourself on YouTube signing songs. Just don't. Learn another sign language if you have the opportunity. When you travel, learn something about the deaf community of that place. Call the media out when they use offensive terms for deaf people or spread misconceptions. Deaf and hard of hearing are not interchangeable terms. They mean different things. Non-hearing and hearing impaired are just not acceptable. If you post videos, caption them with plain text transcriptions to boot, because captions are not accessible to most deaf-blind people. Seriously, caption your videos. If you see an uncaptioned video in the media, ask why it isn't captioned, and then when they will be adding. Deaf people do this all the time, and it's tiring. Be an ally. 3 things I wish you knew. 1, deaf people in general are quite happy being deaf and wouldn't have it any other way. I no more grieve not hearing than I grieve for my lack of prostate or of a 3rd arm, which is not at all. I've never had one, by the way. It would be really weird if I did have one. But I can understand how someone else would be upset if they lost theirs. Number 2, about interpreters. Most sign language interpreters are also spoken language interpreters. By definition, interpreting happens between at least 2 languages. In this context, it's usually between a signed and a spoken language. In the U.S., most typically between ASL and English. Although it is often between ASL and Spanish, there are some different interpreters who are often deaf themselves who work between different signed languages, such as ASL and LSM, Mexican Sign Language, or ASL and LSQ, Quebec Sign Language in Canada. I've done a lot of this myself between various sign languages. Deaf interpreters often interpret between a visual sign language and a tactile sign language with deaf-blind people. I think that's a whole other podcast, though. Oh, and interpreters are not for deaf people or for the deaf, regardless of the name of the National Professional Registry for ASL interpreters in the U.S. Deaf people alone don't need interpreters. It's most often only with hearing people that interpretation becomes necessary. Then the hearing people need interpreters as much as the deaf people. Again, by definition, interpreting happens between at least two languages. So anyone speaking while an interpreter is present is using the interpreter. Anyone listening to what the interpreter is saying is using the interpreter. The interpreter is for everyone in the room, not just for the deaf person or people. It makes sense, of course. It's just that most people don't think it through. And the third, there are certified deaf lifeguards. I was one myself for several years. But you can't hear if a drowning person is calling for help, you say. Anyone who's been through lifeguard training knows that a person who is drowning is physically incapable of calling out or waving or doing anything besides trying to breathe. It's called the instinctive drowning response and includes certain postures. People have drowned just a few feet away from other people, hearing people who have had no idea they were even struggling. Like driving, lifeguarding requires visual alertness and attentiveness, which deaf people may actually have an advantage. Besides, lifeguarding is largely preventative. I only had occasion once to pull someone out of the water who was struggling, and this was from a riptide at the beach when I wasn't even on duty. Oh, and deaf people can dance too. Karen, thank you for this opportunity to chat with you and all your listeners about this. I am proud to have a podcast under my belt now. Thanks.
A huge thank you to Alex for being our first guest on the Wish You Knew podcast. I hope that you have also been able to learn something new about someone who holds an identity that you maybe previously did not understand. Thank you so much for listening, and you will find in the show notes all kinds of links, some of them to things that Alex referenced. I'll put up some links to deaf talent. She used that hashtag, so deaf people that are involved in music and the arts and have put those things up on YouTube. I have a few that are my favorite to follow, so I'll put those in the show notes. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please send them our way. Alex mentioned throughout the interview the importance of interpreters. Our next episode next week will be with someone who works as an interpreter, Dr. Stephen Collins. So be sure to tune in next week and you can learn all about interpreters. Until